item, but actually before we do that, I want to defer to council for a moment.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want to confirm kind of where we left. The last item was that going forward with respect to tomorrow, it's my understanding that the MDC will report back to the board that in fact you now have some data and survey results. There was a robust discussion, in fact, about what that survey meant. We took a lot of public comment. We heard about the top 5, or actually it's more like top 7 things that should be considered. One of those items being the fact that perhaps it would be prudent to essentially carve out shelter medicine and the concept of shelters away from the remainder of the Act. That the CVMA's task force and the MDC's subcommittee on this issue will continue to carry on, and the work on this issue will continue on and will be populated on the various agendas for some time to come.
Yes, I would say that correctly summarizes it.
Any questions about what I said? Because I really didn't understand it. Thank you, Mr. Chair and members.
So our next agenda item is discussion and consideration of extended duty for registered veterinary technician regulations. And this item has been on our agenda for a few meetings now. At our last meeting, we have a report, it's in your minutes, that our subcommittee did not find any extended duties other than those that pertained to the shelter setting. And the filter or the lens here is that there needs to be a need or an access to care issue that we're trying to make sure that we're addressing any of those. But in the end, the conclusion of that subcommittee was that there were none outside of the shelter setting. And within the shelter setting, we did hear a number of those, and I think they all surfaced to the top today. Rabies vaccines, wound debridement, worming medications. We've talked about the discussion of a RVT as a premise permit holder. So I think that some of that actually refers back to the previous agenda item. And so at that point, our subcommittee's work was suspended, and we were actually still seeking comment from the public and from the professional groups in terms of extended duties. So that's where we are.
Correct.
Now, we did receive from Carta the other day, the document.
Yes, I received a private communication. During our work on the subcommittee, we had reached out to various organizations and individuals asking for input. Sometimes it was just public comments or conversations that were exchanged or ideas that were exchanged. Just this last week, I did receive a formal document from the California Registered Veterinary Technicians Association on suggestions for expanded functions with RVTs that I believe has been brought forth to the meeting today for consideration and discussion. And just to continue on what you'd already talked about, Mr. Chairman, I just want to make sure that we have been talking about the extended duties, that many of them probably are going to fall into the realm of shelter medicine, but I want to make sure, and legal counsel has highlighted some of them, that we do keep these topics on the agenda for discussion, which are the administration of rabies vaccination, the sedation has come up repeatedly, the issue of administration of controlled substances, and many of these topics that I think we need to continue to explore. But the recommendation was we explore them not as an individual topic, but as they relate to the other topics that are being discussed. And most certainly, since we have individuals from the shelter community here, if there's very specific tasks, would love to hear from them today. Great.
Point of order?
Yes.
I did not receive any letter.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think that this was just something that was given to us. I didn't think that anybody else got these. So.
So is it on the agenda?
So the issue here is that we're kind of hamstrung. We can talk about it as long as, because once you give something to the board, unless we're in the APA Administrative Procedure Act realm, or legal opinions or something like that. It's pretty much, public discussion, so we can talk about it. I would have to say, though, that probably it would be a little bit difficult to have a full-on, robust, planned-ahead discussion at this meeting, seeing how it's just been made available, I guess, contemporaneously with me talking. So it's really kind of up to what the committee would like to do. My advice to your legal counsel is you may want to take a moment, read it, and determine whether it's something that needs a bit more discussion, then you want to sort of continue on to the next meeting and see if that's the time to have the more robust discussion. So, Anne Marie, I think you were gesturing to the microphone.
Sorry. Well, just in terms of protocol here, the item is agendized, extended duties for RVTs. You did not get an advance copy of this document. I did not have this document to distribute. So it's not available to the public. It's not on the website. Also, the items in this document are a request to both CARBDA and the CVMA to put forth those items that they felt need to be addressed in terms of access to RVT or access to veterinary care, perhaps through RVTs.
I think this came just from CARFTA, not CVMA.
Right.
Okay.
No, I'm prefacing that we requested information
okay.
from both. And that was done immediately after the last meeting. So this did come a little late in the game, and to the extent that each of these individual tasks perhaps are not listed, I think that there is a bit of an issue, an agenda issue, in that getting into the meat and potatoes of each of these tasks. First of all, it's not agendized on the document, on the agenda. Also, the Veterinary Medical Board hasn't delegated the MDC to look into each of these suggested items. I think that it's great that we have the information to perhaps digest. You could ask for comment from the individual that submitted it. You might want to ask questions of that person. But in terms of discussing the merits and whether or not it should or should not be taken up by the MDC, I think we're premature.
I think the other thing, definitely I'll be carrying this to the board tomorrow and giving them a copy of this, and then having the board decide what they want to turn around and assign to the MDC to explore. But the other conversation that has been loud and clear amongst this committee was issues of access and issues of need. And in the quick scan of this document, that is not as clear as I think it could be to make the case for these extended duties. So I would ask that as this continues to move forward, we get a more complete document rather than this list, and that will help us make better decisions.
As Anne-Marie suggested, can we hear at least from the representative of
Yes,
the organization
absolutely.
as to
No.
where the document's headed?
Bill?
Yeah, I'll make a comment after the presentation.
Okay.
I'm Nancy Ehrlich with the California RVT Association. I apologize for getting this to you this late. Is that better?
A little bit better.
How's that?
Good.
Our subcommittee was very late in meeting, and which is why we have these late results. We had a discussion about what direction that we should be going and what was actually intended by the words extended function. Whereas extended functions to be job tasks that RVTs are currently not able to perform legally, or are extended functions job tasks that RVTs can currently perform, but veterinary assistants can also perform, but perhaps should not be performing. And so the committee took the position that they wanted to go with the second group of job tasks, those that RVTs and veterinary assistants can currently perform, but the belief of the committee was that veterinary assistants should not be performing these tasks for the protection of the public. There was one task that they wanted to add to this list, which we took off because we were probably under the misimpression that you wanted things that you were able to do rather than things that the legislature needed to do. The one task that's not on here was the administration of injectable controlled drugs, which is currently veterinary assistants are allowed to do. And it was the feeling of this committee that that's a very risky procedure that should be restricted to people who are licensed. But what you'll see here are, and you asked for justifications for any tasks that we were recommending. And so there's a list of tasks, and there's a list of justifications for why these tasks should be restricted to RVTs. I think it's pretty self-explanatory. And I think you'll find on the last page, I just thought, well, you know, why are we always reinventing the wheel? And I just went and looked at the California Registered Nurses Practice Act, and I found this, which is on the last page. And I haven't looked at their whole Practice Act. I don't know what else it says. But when I found this, I was pretty surprised that they restrict a lot of tasks that we are allowing veterinary assistants to do to RNs. And I thought you might find that interesting. And it kind of helps to justify the direction that we were going with the job tasks that we are recommending be restricted to RVTs.
So, thank you, Nancy. Are you comfortable with me taking this to the board tomorrow, this entire list, including item now 11, administration of injectable controlled drugs, and asking the board if then it may be assigned to
Well,
us
I mean,
in some
there's no
capacity?
point in this going forward if the board isn't interested. So
Yeah.
certainly, and I think this document pretty much speaks for itself. So
Questions, discussion from the committee?
Question. So we already have on our agenda, it's been agendized, the extended duty from the board. I guess I would think, you know, not asking the board to look at every single item as much as just informing them that we just received this and this is a list we're going to do. And I think they've already assigned it to us the way I, at least in past, when I've been involved with board communications and things like that. I think we have it, it's in our purview, but I also think that today's not the day to go through with our agenda and everything else. Plus, the seriousness of a number of these items on here is going to take quite a bit of deliberation and everything else. I, for one, would like to look at this, think about it, and look at other practice acts.
And just as a point, the original job task, I mean, the Veterinary Medical Board, when RVTs were created, the legislature gave the Veterinary Medical Board the job of defining job tasks for RVTs and for then unregistered assistants. Those job tasks haven't really been reviewed in a very, very long time. I mean, there have been a couple of job tasks that have been added, but the ones that exist currently that have never been reviewed, not since the 1970s, and veterinary practice has changed a lot since the 1970s. So this is why we were going for these higher end type of tasks that may not even have been conceived of in the 1970s, that not only weren't RVTs doing these things, veterinarians weren't even doing a lot of these things. So to assume that job tasks that were appropriate in the 1970s are still appropriate in 2016 going forward is something that we think should be looked at.
Yes.
To follow up on Dr. Grant on what you said, after I received this document, I reviewed it, and Nancy, thank you for a very thorough document with a lot of things to think about. My concern of it, as I read it, was that it falls under Section 2036, and that's the section that talks, for want of a better term, RVT-only job tasks, and where things are restricted to RVTs or DVMs, and the veterinary assistants or unregistered assistants cannot perform those tasks. And I'm just not sure that the board truly asked us to look at that type of tasks as part of the extended functions. Now, if that was implied, I'm comfortable with that either way, but I think just for clarity's sake, it should go to the board, and they should ask us to take a look at this as it relates to 2036.
So, in my mind, and I could have been on an island here in terms of what I assumed an extended function was. Typically, when we talk about extended functions are something beyond the current scope of practice for an RVT. It wasn't restricting other personnel from functions that are already authorized. That's different. That is essentially changing their scope of responsibility. So it's veterinary assistants should not be doing certain things that's limiting a scope of responsibility for another paraprofessional, if you will. And again, we looked at this as, because this is a board considering extended functions as access and a need for additional personnel to participate in or be part of the delivery of services, because there is an issue getting this service to the public, because there is a shortage or there is a need out there for animals to be treated and there are not enough veterinarians to essentially fill that need. So now we're talking about restricting a completely separate category from doing things. So that reduces access. It doesn't increase access. And I know you've all heard me say this, and I invite you to check with the legislature or the Department of Consumer Affairs or counsel as he's sitting to my right. The board's role as a consumer protection agency is not to expand anybody's scope of practice, whether it be veterinarians, nurses, docs, dentists, acupuncturists, and so forth. It is to respond to a public need. If there is a consumer protection issue that is not being addressed by the current state of laws and regulations, the board has an obligation to examine that. Restricting a paraprofessional's scope of responsibility, unless we can identify the risk, and maybe that's what this document does, is identify the risk that is currently not being addressed. We're no longer talking about extended functions for RVTs. We're talking about something different. So I agree with Dave that I don't think this was included in the board's delegation to the MDC.
Questions, comments from the committee?
Well,
Yes.
my only comment to that is the items that are listed in 2030-16, inducing anesthesia, apply casts and splints, dental extractions, there was not a need to do that beyond what is current.
Mhm.
That's not why they were put in here. I think it is somewhat inherent in what the risk assessment was. That's what this is, I think, is looking at what risk assessment. Some of these things can be done currently, and some of them can't be done at all. So there's a mixture of both populations in this list. I mean, the rabies things, they can't do now, and it's not, I mean, so there's just, I think it needs to be looked at. I would think that the board hopefully looks at it and says, yeah, go through and then go through every one of these items. But some of it is risk associated, some of it they can't do anyway, and it does interface, I think, with 2036.
Well, and the board does have a legislative mandate to define the job tasks for RVTs and veterinary assistants. And it does also have a mandate to protect the public. And each one of these job tasks is a more risky procedure than a typical procedure that occurs in a veterinary hospital, with the intent that only a licensed person with proper training should be performing these procedures. And as I said before, it's been 40 years since the job tasks were actually reviewed, and practice has changed a lot. And I'm not certain that it was the intention of the board that this be concluded in extended functions. This is part of why this report is late, and that we were having a problem trying to figure out exactly what direction to go in. So I would definitely encourage you to take this to the board, see what the board thinks about going in this direction, and then we'll be happy to go further with that.
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Just a question for Nancy. Where did you get this list? How did you come up with these 10 things?
The people on the committee came up with these procedures. I actually, believe it or not, I was not in that committee meeting, so I don't know exactly how this list was generated.
So it was a carved committee that came up with these 10 things?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Nancy. Comments, questions, committee?
The only comment I have would be, again, to ask the people in the audience, back to our extended duties topic, is there any access to service issues that we haven't already touched on in our initial discussion? If anyone wanted to make further comment in that area.
Hi, Leah Schupeltz, CVMA RVT Committee. I was just going to express what I expressed at the last meeting. The RVT Committee met recently, and we talked about the extended duties for RVTs as far as not expanding scope of practice, but what we were asked for on behalf of this board, and again, got nothing mentioned as far as anything that people on our committee thought needed to be discussed. So just thought I would share that. Again.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, Jennifer.
I have a question. On
Sure.
both the CARVDA and the CVMA committees that worked on this, were there any shelter personnel on those committees?
No, I actually should say one person on our board did have a few things, but they were strictly for shelter medicine, rabies vaccines, and we did talk about intake things, so I should say those things were already addressed today. So other than some things for the shelter, but nothing as far as other, as far as regular practice. So something was mentioned about a rabies vaccine being done by RVT, and then some intake protocol things. And that was from somebody who is no longer in shelter medicine, but has worked in the shelters in the past. So that, I think she had 3 things, and Dan talked to her about them as well, and she was talking specifically about shelter medicine, so not about practice across the board. But it was no different than when I emailed and made some contacts again when we met in person. I said I would get back to you guys this time, but it has not changed. Nobody had anything else to add to the list.
Okay, I just did want to reassert that there is an access issue in shelter medicine, so I don't want the issue to be completely disregarded. And it is ambitious, but we have somewhere to start. I would just personally, as a board member, I'd like an opportunity to read this document before any discussion on it.
I think that I don't want anybody to think that we've said we know there's shelter. I think that goes without saying. We know that there's shelter. That's the only thing that's ever come up. Is RVT extended duties. It always comes up as shelter. We need more duties when it comes to shelter medicine. But that's whenever we asked for input, we got shelter medicine. So, especially when it came to the public.
Right.
And none of these have anything to do with shelter medicine, except maybe assessment of a patient condition.
And rabies specimen
And
processing.
rabies. Those are it.
processing.
Any other comments from the public? Any comments from the committee?
Do you need any type of a formal recommendation, or is this, you're going to exercise your prerogative as chairman?
Mr. Johnson and members, I think this could be one of those kind of general consensus items that, in fact, without objection from the audience, without objection from any board members, the chair would essentially bring this document to the committee, to the board, and just sort of ask for sort of continued authorization to tackle this issue, being at a late emergence at the meeting today, with the understanding that we'll digest it, probably a bad example, but, and then after lunch, and then it'll be on the agenda for the next MDC, as it interplays with perhaps going beyond, except for those 2 items mentioned, going beyond the shelter discussion that we just had.
Okay. General consensus that the chair's going to try and do that tomorrow? We good? Okay. Anything else from the public? Our next agenda item is review and discuss the veterinary student exemption. You've got, let's see, item 6 in this packet. You've got a memo there from our counsel, Kurt Hepler. There is a memo from the advisory, or from the subcommittee that looked into this, and Diana Woodward-Hagel did the heavy lifting on that. You have the AVMA COA accreditation policies and procedures. And then finally, there is proposed language, and that proposed language was put together by a subcommittee that included Dr. Druses, myself, Ron Terra from Western University, and John Pasco from UC Davis. And so that was the group, the working group, that put this together. We have 2 different sections, a statute and then a regulation that we're discussing here. So we've got proposed language for 4830, and there are 2 versions of this language that are in front of you. And 4830 deals with the student that is a part of their curriculum in an educational setting, and that not only includes the formal curriculum, but also in the off-campus or distributive sites. So there are two pieces to that. And let's go ahead and talk about 4830 first before we move into the second part, which is 2027. So,
You wanting input from
yeah,
us?
so committee members, yeah, I wanted to give you a second
Just digest that, yes, we're all
I think this is
digesting
the
it.
part where we say something, isn't it?
Yeah, it's all right.
Okay.
It's all right.
I had
It's all
to-
good. We're warming up.
I found it interesting that, not unlike other considerations today, we're dealing with vocabulary and statements that are based in fact, were based in fact 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago. By that I specifically mean with the students is freshman, sophomore, junior, and senior. In the classic education that most of us had, all those, that was a universal truth. I would be suggesting, is there not a way that we can get away from that classification? Certainly based upon the distributive model, one, and the problem-based learning model, two, that blurs the lines between these 4 years. And they're to restrict or to define certain activities based on a protocol that was established 50 years ago may not be accurate in today's world.
So I'm confused because I don't see a reference here to freshman, sophomore in this language.
I just want to make sure that that the old manner in looking at this
Right.
was reflective on years
Right.
of study. The new model shouldn't have any of that stuff. And, okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
Bill.
One of the things that I noted proposed from this committee, or at least presented by the chair here, 4830A5A is now one of the big changes, is opening this up from Western and Davis to all AVMA accredited schools.
Yes.
I think that's a huge point we need to discuss to begin with. Top. Why was that put there that way? And I guess I'd like to hear from the universities, their feeling on this, and certainly the committees.
Can we get Dr. Pasco and Dr. Tara up? We've got a microphone for each of you. So we have discussed this, and I think one of the key points that I've heard is that we actually export more students for their education than we import.
So the question, what's our opinion on opening this up to all accredited veterinary schools?
Correct.
I'm trying not to put words in my dean's mouth. Me personally, I've got no problem with it, and I believe he's on board with that also. As long as it's an accredited veterinary school, he might go a step further, like within North America, but
I'm not sure what the focus of your question is.
The focus was really, in the past, when we had the student exemption, it pertained to the California schools, the two schools here in California. Now, this proposal has opened that up to any AVMA accredited school for the student exemption, not for post-training, post-EVM training, but for students outside of California in their third or fourth year, although we've talked about the third, fourth year not being placed in here.
So, like many things that have been discussed today, this has a long history. I go back as far as at least when Nancy Collins was involved with this.
Here's a nice
And this used to be discussed with the students at UC Davis. And the issue historically has been that there are a lot of students from other schools that are involved in veterinary activities and practices in California. And so the act as it currently is speaks just to the 2 California schools, but not to students from all these other schools. And so the question is, where does the consumer protection piece come into this? The other compounding issue that we ran into, or we're running into, still do run into frequently, is we get calls from practices in California that say, hey, we've got a student from school X here, and we need some help with liability coverage. And so they're wanting us to enroll these students for the period, and we just say, no, they're not our students. So it's trying to just solve a bunch of different problems. But the real thing was to be very clear that any student from any accredited school that was engaged in an externship type experience in practice in California would be permitted to do so under the current act. So it was that simple. Clarifying.
Then, that's the school's perspective. With the board, is there an issue with going back and looking at, students that would not be covered in the Practice Act if they're outside the state of California?
So this is something that we talked about at a couple of MDC meetings, and we're really now talking about, before I heard the argument that we're opening it up to non-California based schools and that's going to displace California students from having a place to do externships, which I understand is not the case. The second issue is, okay, if we do have students in California that are participating in externships, who's responsible for those students? And the debate amongst the MDC was, well, it should be the supervisor, because that supervisor has to have an externship agreement with that university that placed that student. So it truly does go back to the university. So for UC Davis and Western, you place students outside of California, correct?
Correct.
Those students are still under the university's umbrella. Therefore, the liability piece kind of ensures those students that during that externship site with that supervisor, you have an agreement, a relationship. The same thing should be true for any out-of-state university, and it may be part of the COE's accreditation requirements that when they place students for an accredited institution or School of Veterinary Medicine, and Dr. Pasco would know this, that if they're placing students in externship sites outside of the state, that the university remains liable, not a great word, but responsible for the training of that student until they graduate. Can you speak to that?
I think that's a fair statement. So I can speak specifically for the UC system. Students that are in any educational experience that's approved by the institution, so has to be approved, are covered by the general liability policy of the university.
So what it boils down to is I don't think it's any different than what we exercise here in terms of oversight. It's really the university that's responsible for that student until that student's no longer a student. And then at that point, obviously, depending on the licensing structure for that individual, they're no longer liable. But the placement and the externship requirements of that placement should speak to that for every university. I don't think it's any different in human medicine than it would be in veterinary medicine.
Got Dave and then Diana.
I just wanted to comment because I brought this up at other meetings. And again, I always hate to focus everything on the shelter world, but we do get a lot of phone calls. And I would regularly get phone calls from students that had relatives in California or lived in California, went to another veterinary college, knew that there were good shelters in California that was practicing good veterinary medicine, and they wanted to come here under their school's program. And all we could tell them was, no, you would be a veterinary assistant and unregistered here in California. If you want to come hang out and watch, you can do that, but we cannot enter into any formal agreements. And so those calls do occur on a regular basis, but it's a formal program with formal documents with everything that the two universities here in California have, just coming from another university for a very specific purpose.
Diana and then Bill.
Answering your specific question about AVMA, I do encourage you not to ignore my offering, which starts on the last page about the third of the way down, I've got it in quotes, and I've got parentheses A. Veterinary students enrolled in an AVMA hyphen accredited veterinary school, et cetera. And the reason for that is Title 16, CCR, Section 2022, A, So that language and your language incorporates that acknowledgement. I just wanted to point that out.
So we're talking, I just want to make sure that I understand this then, because we're talking about liability. Somebody's dog dies, somebody's doing a spay, they nick the aorta, whatever happens, the dog dies. There's going to be, if there's an issue with the supervising veterinarian, that chain goes back to the state board. What about liability to the owner that lost the animal? And restitution to the client who lost the animal. Now, when I talk about liability, I know that the AVMA has a PLIT liability that's there. But if they don't sign up for that, or in California, if they don't sign up for our state CVMA sponsored, does the university take care of that liability for the loss of that animal to that client?
We cover our students with university's got a liability insurance policy.
A general liability insurance policy that even if they didn't have any AVMA or CVMA policies,
The student,
you would
right.
compensate the owner for the loss of that animal.
I do know of one case where we had to buy a mare.
Rectal tear on a palpation, somebody's doing something like that.
Well, the insurance covered it, sorry.
And you're, Dr. Pasco, that's the same at Davis as far as you know?
I'm not going to answer the question that specifically, Bill. That's where lawyers come into the discussion, right?
Right.
So the answer is the students, if they're involved in an approved educational activity, they're covered by the University General Liability policy. If there were a claim, risk management would deal with it, and then it would be a contest of lawyers, liars, whatever, to decide what the outcome would be.
So I feel like the conversation is going a little sideways, because you seem like you're concerned about liability, Bill, and you're talking about what they're doing for their students, yet I also feel like you're worried about other students coming in. And so I guess I don't know what you're really worried about, first of all. Secondly, the AVMA policy for students on externships is a $2 million policy, and it's free.
I got that. So CVMAs, I got that.
Yeah, it's
I know
free.
all that.
Okay, so again, you seem like you're concerned about liability, but it seems like there's a couple of tools here where that is being addressed.
There have been a few out-of-state with California students problems. One was up in Washington years ago, and there was an issue with liability. So I just, if
I don't know, was that an approved, so there is a distinction between whether it's approved as part of the curriculum or it isn't.
I don't know that specific.
Okay.
Yes, Dick.
I also had concerns with this. However, the Memorandum of Understanding, if that's enforced, that satisfies me. I don't want students coming in from other states doing surgery or diagnosing and treating at the pleasure of a veterinarian that has the supervision of the student. There's got to be a link back to the school and to the program. So if there's a memorandum of understanding, I'm fine with that.
So speaking of which, there are two versions of this language that are in front of you, and the difference between the two really is about 4830A5B, which is about the off-campus or distributive sites, and the MOU. So it's about the Memorandum of Understanding. And Dr. Tara, if you'll kind of explain your take on this compared to the original language that we had, I thought your
Yes.
perspective was intriguing.
It is our opinion, and and I'm paraphrasing our dean, but that the duties of the Veterinary Medical Board is protect the consuming public. It is the duty of the AVMA Council on Education to make certain that we are training our students to certain standards. We don't really want to see an educational type of mandate within the Practice Act or the Business and Professions Code. So we're okay with an MOU. We've got no problem with that. That would outline the responsibilities and the relationship between our school and any private practice in the state of California. We have similar ones. We'd probably have to beef it up just a little bit based upon the language that's here. But when it comes to the board mandating that the educational content of that experience, we have those in syllabi that are approved by our faculty and are under perusal by WASC, which is now, WASC is now changed as, anyway. And then the COE looks at them also. So this would just be another layer that we'd have to try to meet as an educational institution. I think our dean put it, he said, professional standards does not include, in our opinion, professional standards does not include curricular design of the accredited institutions or even the standards that those accredited institutions have in terms of quality assurance of the curriculum that they have in place. Whereas the VMB educational, we would rewrite this so that the MOU would somehow ensure that the public is protected while our students are on that educational experience at that site. Questions?
Okay, questions on that? Comment.
So, just to speak to the board's role. So,
Yeah.
Consumer protection, as you mentioned, also includes the student. It also includes the application process to become a veterinarian. And as part of those pre-qualification processes, approving the educational format is part of the board's purview. So in the law, you'll see, in order to become a veterinarian, you have to go to an accredited school of veterinary medicine. You have to accomplish this much in order to, earn the degree and obtain the license. So I disagree with the dean that it's not the board's role to look at education. That's the front end. The back end is the enforcement side and the consumer protection side. Both serve to protect the public. So while the board might not get into the minutia of accreditation with the veterinary schools in terms of what each of those educational outcomes look like, it is our job to globally regulate those pre-qualifications to licensure, including education. So, I respect the dean saying, hey, we've got an accreditation standard that we meet. Why would the board want to, get into the weeds of the accreditation standards? But taking a step back, we could not acknowledge AVMA accreditation at all. If the board chose that AVMA wasn't necessarily that gold standard anymore, the board could go in a completely different direction. It's within the board's purview. I just want to make that point.
Thank you.
So we've looked at this now for a year or thereabouts. We have come close to voting on it a couple of times. The last time we then sent it out to a subcommittee. It's back in front of you. So here we are. Let's get some comfort level with this and make a recommendation to the board.
I have a question
Yes.
about the phrase formal curriculum. What does that mean?
Could you use your microphone, please?
Oh, sorry about that. I have a question about the phrase formal curriculum. What does that mean exactly?
The students are either taking a specified, they're taking a specified course. In order to graduate, they have to successfully accomplish that course or that clinical rotation. To me, that's part of that's a formal curriculum, as opposed to taking a long weekend off and going back home and working at the practice that they did their pre-veterinary work at. That would not be part of their formal curriculum. And Dr. Pasco, I think, touched briefly on this. We do have club events under the direct supervision of a faculty member, although that's not required for graduation, that is considered part of, it's a college sanctioned, so they would be covered in that instance also.
So he touched on most of it. I think one of the reasons, and Alan touched on this in his introductory comments, is that as curricula have changed over time, was sort of removing the more specific time-stamped pieces of it. The formal curriculum piece was, I use surgery or anesthesia as an example, if the student has satisfied that coursework as part of their degree requirements and the faculty responsible for that have given that student a passing grade, then this language would speak to that they could then do that in a practice setting. I mean, it would be a trivial example, but, if you took something like a bandaging lab, that might be a club activity versus where it occurred more formally in the curriculum. So did I just confuse you more, or did that help?
Well, it's not my confusion, but it's the reader's confusion,
So I think the formal curriculum means that course of study approved by the faculty to satisfy the degree requirements.
I rather prefer the word appointment, which is in the current statute, to memorandum of understanding. And I would add some language to that as well.
Well,
Do you contemplate the licensed veterinarian being a member of the faculty or not?
In our distributive model, the licensed veterinarians that provide the educational experiences that our students receive in their third and fourth year are not considered full-time members of the faculty. They have a term called adjunct faculty that they have to apply for, and not all of them are approved. All of our core sites would be probably adjunct faculty. Don't hold me to that. Did that answer your question?
I'm trying to find where I saw the word appointment, whether it's in the current statute or
I don't-
one of the
It's under,
proposals.
when you talk about off-campus, under 4830A5, it says, including those off-campus educational programs under the direct supervision of a licensed veterinarian in good standing.
Appointed.
Yes, as
Right,
defined
that's-
by, and this is appointed by the University of California, Davis, or the Western University of Health Sciences. I think the context, though, has changed so much in the proposed that appointed may not be an operative word.
They're approved.
Yeah.
I added some language to that, and I'd like you to consider that in the existing statute. I added a sentence. The appointment shall be in writing, comma, stating the responsibilities of the licensed veterinarian and the animal care tasks the student may perform, period. And you can expand that also, that if it's a formal curriculum, by stating with particularity the course or the activity that you are appointing the licensed veterinarian to oversee.
I'm sorry, I'm at a loss to know where.
I know.
Diana, the input's important, but I want to try and avoid rewriting as much as possible, I'll be honest. So I'm going to ask you, as you look at this, is the structural change that you're proposing critical to the intent of what we're doing here? If it is semantic, but not particularly impactful, then maybe we can try and move forward with this without nickel and diming some of the words.
I'm trying to tack down some specifics that the licensed veterinarian is expected to meet. So if it's Anatomy 101 or something like that, or a club function, I think there should be a writing that's the responsibility of the institution to draft for the licensed veterinarian.
And you
That's what I'm getting at.
don't believe that the Memorandum of Understanding is part of that? This is a two-part question. One is, it sounds like you don't believe that the MOU is part of it. And secondly, I would have you reference the AVMA COE document that's preceding the language, because that describes the elements of what is essentially going to be in an MOU, and I think that tacks things down pretty cleanly.
But it's not part of the statute. See, a memorandum of understanding is simply a writing. It's a contract, but it's a writing specifying certain rights and responsibilities, and that's all I'm asking for, and in more plain English rather than a memorandum of understanding. Somehow that just doesn't resonate to me, and I don't think it would to the casual reader who just wants some information.
Dick?
Yeah, I'm going to ask our legal counsel to explain to me the difference between the two versions of B, because I've looked at them several times and I'm not understanding a significant difference. And I'm sure that's there, I'm just not picking up on it.
Good morning and good afternoon, everybody. So let's, if I may, yeah, I'm sorry, a little chemical holiday there. So my water. So with A5A, I'm on the first page. A5A is, I'll call that the opening up the scope model, or opening up the floodgates model, because this would allow, this would allow essentially out-of-state imports, probably not a good term because we're not talking about automobiles, but to come in and do certain things. Is that correct, Dr. Klingborg?
Yes.
Okay. So then I get to A5B, the first thing. This is on the bottom of the page. And this seems to be the grave difference that I see between this version and the next version is, I think, the dean's perspective is that there is going to be no formal description of what is supposed to be learned, indicating you go there to this off-site facility and it's just going to be the practice comes in, the formal affiliation agreement, the MOU, whatever is reduced to writing is going to say, student, you're doing this is what you're going to do, be here 8 to 5, don't play with it, don't run with scissors, lunch is from 12 to 1, and we don't work on the weekends. The supervisor says something like, every 30 days I'm going to review your performance, we'll keep a chart of how you're doing, you can expect performance reviews in 60 days, 90 days, whatever, sort of almost like a tacit employment agreement, if you will. That's what is not going to be part of that's what's going to be part of the secondary one on page 2. But the one on page, the first version will contain the educational objectives, which is missing from the two. So that's the large difference that I see. There'll be no like, hey, you're going to learn how to do, and I don't know anything about veterinary medicine. You're going to do this, that, tasks. You're going to be expected to do X, Y, Z, A prime, B prime. This is the scope of stuff you're going to see. That would be reduced to writing in the first version. You're going to see these things. The second version, not going to see. There's going to be no description of what you're going to be expected to do, except whatever those things are, you will be expected to do them competently. From 8 to 5, like I said, that sort of thing. So that's the line of demarcation in my mind between the two.
Well, but isn't the MOU between the university and the practice? So therefore, the university can set out what the goals are and expectations are. I don't see where we're dictating any education level there.
Well, I'm sorry, because what I see with one, it says, so on the bottom says a written description of the educational objectives to be achieved at the site. So that to me, educational objective is, I'll insert the words, what I'm going to do on my summer vacation here, right? I'm going to learn how to do this thing. The second version says a written description of the responsibilities of the parties signing the MOU, with that other language stricken out. So that's why I came to that conclusion that I did.
Dr. Tara?
Yeah, and the second version kind of gets back to what Diana was saying. The responsibilities of both parties. And from our standpoint, if if we approve a site and a preceptor for a cardiology rotation, then we expect that student to get a good cardiological experience, and that's written up in our syllabi, learning objectives, and the learning experiences that we hope that the student would receive. The big thing, I think, from our dean's standpoint was this appears, in the first version, appears to allow, and it gets back, and I apologize, Anna Marie, was that would allow the legislature or the Veterinary Medical Board to come back to Western University of Health Sciences and say that the educational objectives are not being met, or they can change that and tweak it and say, we don't like your educational objectives, and we'd like you to start doing this and this and this. And I know we're being kind of fear-mongers in the whole thing, but, and
Yes,
the dean's
Bill.
going to shoot me based upon what I'm saying, but that's okay. I'm ready to retire. So,
Yeah, I would agree with that. If between the MOU and what this place goes through for the AVMA COE, for us to write that there, I think it's superfluous, and there's far greater details in both of these other documents than is here. And if we put this here, does that mean that we have to approve it?
No. So I think there's a misconception, and I think that's what we need to talk about what this is. This just says that it exists, that there's a written protocol for what those expectations are or learning outcomes at that site. That already exists. I do appreciate and understand the dean's perspective from, this is a legislative amendment, so once this goes to the legislature, everybody's hands can get into, what this should mean. So I do appreciate the sensitivity. This doesn't mean that the board is now going to approve all the MOUs. It's saying that as part of your protocol for the university, when you vet a site, an extern site, there is a formal agreement with that extern site, and that formal agreement includes some written objectives and outcomes. That's covered in the COE, so it's covered in the accreditation under AVMA. So it is moot. I mean, you really don't need to restate it here. For the comfort level of folks that were concerned about, as Dr. Sullivan mentioned, what really happens when we take students from out of state? Is there a formal written agreement? We know what Western and what UC Davis does, but we don't know what every other university does throughout the country. And that's why my initial statement went back to, what does the accreditation require? Because if it's all satisfied in the AVMA accreditation standards, this may not be necessary. This is due diligence. Is the board enforcing a standard that every institution, university across the country that may place students in California to do their externship has written educational objectives as part of their formal agreement with that extern site? If it's a non-issue because it's covered in accreditation and it's covered to the degree that the MDC and the board is comfortable with, this language may not be necessary. But remember, we're talking about statute, so it's not just everybody at this table agreeing that this looks good. When you go to the legislature, you're going to have to defend that according to accreditation standards, there isn't loopholes in here. And if you can defend that by virtue of looking at the AVMA accreditation, it may be a non-issue.
To that point, and I think it is an AVMA COE, far greater at that level, and you made a comment that the board needs to enforce this. The only way that you're going to enforce it is if you read it and approve it. Because otherwise, you're not even going to know how to enforce it because you don't know what it says.
You just know it exists as part of the educational standards.
I think we're going way too deep on this.
Yeah, I agree.
The only thing I want is that if there is a problem in a practice and we go in there and there's a student doing surgery and he doesn't have any kind of contract, now we can do enforcement. But what I want to see is the memorandum of understanding that we know there's a link between that student and the school he's coming from. I don't think we need to get down into what that memorandum is saying or what the implications it is with COE. I think that's way too deep. I just want to have a paper trail that I can go in and follow and make sure there is a contract between the veterinarian that's licensed, the student, and linked back to the university education program. I think what I've heard is that there are students coming in on externships to the state from other schools that don't have any contract or any memorandum of understanding. And that's what we have to, I think that's what we're enforcing. I don't think it's any deeper than that. But then, I'm not a very deep person, so.
I'd like to get public comment at this point. No, let's have you stay for now. Thank you, though.
Since you're sharing a mic.
You need to defend yourself.
Yes.
So can I just ask, so you would strike B then, and just keep A?
Strike first. I don't have a big problem with either one. I'm still thinking that we're delving too deep into both of them. I just want that memorandum of understanding, that there's
Yeah, he's not
a
that
paper
paranoid.
trail there.
Here's the value I see in B in the first version, and that is if I'm a practitioner and I'm contacted by an out-of-state school that says we want to send somebody to see you, and it's not explicit in here, what's my due diligence to go back and make sure that I have checked all these boxes in terms of what that MOU should have? And by having at least these objectives there, I think it makes it clear. I mean, Diana talks about wanting clarity in the reader to know what that contract should have. I think that the first version makes it pretty clear. Is it redundant because of what the COE says? Sure, but only if you know what the COE says. So, any public comment? Cool.
Well,
Yeah.
And then, because I was part of the subcommittee or task force, when I read the first version, I'm sitting there going, okay, we do this already.
Right.
Right.
And it was my dean explaining to me that he didn't like the way that was just written because it could possibly give. In reality, I think I agree with Dr. Sullivan. Why do we need paragraph B? Maybe just add, as long as there's an MOU in place, and leave it at that. I mean, we went how many years where it was just basically paragraph A, and specifically for UC Davis students and then eventually Western U students. I really see the value of, if we put all accredited schools there, then all of us have to be under the same standard. We all have to meet the same standard if we want to have our students train in this state, and it definitely protects the public that way. So.
This issue is here because there were concerns about externships. I mean, this.
Well, it all started with the university licensure thing. And the university licensure is a graduate veterinarian, non-licensed in this state, working under the auspices of a university, either UC Davis or Western University, who then moonlights, for lack of a better term, and picks up some extra money. Or, number two, there's a problem with an animal while they're actually working for the university, and there was no way for the veterinary medical board to satisfy the public's need for recourse. And then that led to a discussion of, well, look at what our students get to do out there. And the difference is the two terms, direct supervision or immediate supervision of a licensed veterinarian in the state of California. I did that for 24 years. I know it was my license in my rear end if a student messed up on a cow I was doing surgery on. So.
Okay, committee, where are we going with this? Yep, Dick.
I move that we move forward language 4030 that is being proposed, A and B on the first page.
I'll second that for discussion purposes and not wanting to muddy the waters, but I have to ask the question. We're talking about formal activities, either by in-state educated students or out-of-state accredited university students. What happens when the shelter club on Saturdays goes to shelter XYZ for experience?
And that's what 2027 is.
Well, I just, for that purpose, I want to know, is there an MOU between the university and the shelter? Is that relationship somehow formalized between the university and the shelter, specifically then the licensed and premise holding veterinarian?
I'd have to understand that a little bit more, Alan. I mean, I was trying to think about it in the context. So you're just saying if a student club decided to do something with a local shelter? I would say it's not.
It's my understanding, I wasn't never involved in this kind of stuff, but it's my understanding that there are clubs of all sorts that go out and, for lack of a better term, give back and help out, assist, go to shelters. I'm sure they're not doing all RVT-only tasks there. It's my understanding that some of them are doing spays and neuters on Saturday mornings as well. And is there some kind of formal/informal relationship then between the university, that location, a veterinarian, and covered by liability?
If the board adopts this language, then I think what we would do at Western is allow the board to come back to us and tell us, help us answer that question, because a club activity is not part of their formal curriculum. But if we do have an MOU in place and there is a faculty member supervising these students, I don't know. I can't answer that question right now. They're covered liability-wise on the university's liability insurance and probably the AVMA's if they have it in place in terms of the individual students.
Okay, I don't want to cloud the issue. I mean, I'm satisfied with the motion and my second, but I think that this is something that needs to be discussed at some point in time, too.
So I think that if this passes, this brings clarity to that, which would be that would not be allowed.
Yeah,
that would be perfectly fine. And we don't do anything like that, and I couldn't imagine that happening, but our club activities that involve animals have to have faculty involved. The students can't do it without, it won't be approved without faculty involved. The other parallel I would give you is Spay Day, which when we do it on campus, the veterinary students only participate, so that we'll have first through fourth years involved, they only participate in veterinary activities at the level that they're training, even internally. So you don't have a first-year student spaying a dog.
And certainly someone can argue that's a university-sanctioned activity if it's taking place on the campus.
No, but I was trying to use it as a parallel example. I don't disagree that what you're suggesting happens, just like we heard about other things happening this morning. I think part of what we're trying to do is have some clarity to this so that you can actually say to somebody, no, that's not approved. That's actually in contravention to the Practice Act.
The next step from my point is the phone calls that we all get from in-state and out-of-state students that, hey, I've got 3 weeks. Can I come to volunteer? Can I come to your shelter? And the inference is that they get to do stuff.
But I would go back to what John said earlier. It's incumbent on the shelter and the shelter veterinarian, if there's one there, to have that MOU with the school that student's coming from.
Well, and again, we've got 2027 coming up, which is when it's outside the formal curriculum, what you can do. So that's the next conversation.
So,
Bill.
I think B, the second one, I agree with A, obviously that's not the discussion, and I think it does need to be put in, like we said, but the 4030A 5B on the second page really is more accurate of what's happening in there, and I think it states everything that needs to be stated, either from COE or the MOU between the university and the off-site facility refers back to the MOU, and I think that's a more complete way of looking at it.
I have a question for the deans. There's a difference in language between in place of formal curriculum and as part of formal curriculum. And it seems to me that you, as representatives of your institutions, would want it to be in as part of, rather than in place of, because that's so limiting.
It says in place of on-campus education.
Correct.
That's still part of the formal curriculum, whether it's on campus
Well,
or off campus.
it's a different phrase, though, you see. As part of their formal
Well,
curriculum in
it's-
5A.
The formal curriculum can either be provided on campus or off campus. Ours is clinically, it's all off campus. It's totally distributed.
That's right.
And so, but it's still part of the formal curriculum. And it's just that it happens off campus.
It seems to me that you would want as part of the formal curriculum, because it's not so limiting.
It does say
In
where
place of-
off-campus or distributive sites
Well-
provide the formal curriculum.
Yes, but you have a special circumstance where all of your clinical experience is technically off-campus. Isn't that true?
True,
Okay.
for the
So
most part.
that's kind of unique.
90-some-odd%.
Yeah. I'm directing it more at Dean Pasco.
She's telling me that sentence there.
Yeah, I'm not sure I'm following.
So Diana, I think what I'm hearing you say is if we take a 4830A5B, and I'm on the first version, which is the one that's been motioned, and we delete the phrase "in place of on-campus education." And so it reads, where off-campus or distributive sites provide the formal curriculum, comma, a memorandum of understanding between the accredited veterinary program. Do you follow?
Yes, but I would say as part of the formal curriculum.
Does it make a big difference is my question.
I think in place of says it's an absolute demarcation.
Well, it's either on campus or it's off campus, so there is a demarcation there.
Well, are the courses that easily translatable to a private veterinary hospital?
And what was the question? I'm
That's
sorry.
all part of the COE accreditation process.
Or that, will you repeat your question,
Yeah,
Diana?
All right, it just seems to me that you would want, as part of the formal curriculum, instead of in place of on-campus education.
But Diana, it's not saying in place of formal curriculum, it's just saying in place of on-campus education.
Okay.
So you have to complete that phrase. It's not in place of formal curriculum, it's in place of being on campus. They're talking about off campus.
All right, I see.
You
I
could
do.
strike that all together and get the same meaning as Dr. Klingborg recommended, which would be where off-campus or distributed sites provide formal curriculum, a MOU between the accredited. So you could strike that whole intermediate phrase.
I would be happier.
Okay, there you go. I got you.
Okay. So there's a motion and a second on this, and I will ask the motioner in the second, would you be comfortable with striking the phrase "in place of on-campus education"
Yes.
there?
Agreed.
Okay. Any other, yes?
I have just one question, Dr. Schall. I'm just curious why your preference of the first version over the second version of B.
I think the differences are minimal, and I'm comfortable with what it says. I don't interpret the interpretation of our good friend Dean Nelson. I don't think it says that. I'm comfortable with how it's written.
My concern about the second version is that the educational objectives piece is deleted. And I think therefore there's a lack of clarity in the second piece. While we may all understand that the MOU is going to have the educational objectives in it, the casual reader is not. And I think that it's simply spelling that out without it being Orwellian that Big Brother BMB is going to be getting their hands in the cake batter here in terms of how to educate the students. I think it helps clarify things. Any other discussion? We're going to call for the vote now.
Public comment?
Oh, yeah, sorry. Public comment again, one more time. Yes. Dr. Tara.
So if this is brought forward to the board tomorrow and the board adopts this language, Just so I can go back to my dean, how does this then protect the public?
So, two things. Do you want me to? Okay, so two things. One, it gives some structure because we're now changing the law to say this doesn't only apply to California students that are under our two respected universities where we are completely comfortable with the protocol. We are now opening this up to the rest of the country. So we are now offering that educational setting here in California for institutions in other states to have their students here. So it's providing protection for the student. It's also providing protection for the public. When you come here, there is a formal agreement in place that says your time here must be spent on a set of educational objectives that's communicated with your site. And there is a formal agreement between the university and the site as to what you will learn while you're here in California completing your externship. I don't disagree that it's covered. It's actually number 5 under the COE. It is covered. But when we talk about something legislatively, you can leave it very broad and then you can ask for people to define it for you. Or you can look at the language to say they've checked the boxes, they've made sure that, again, we have no control as a board over how the AVMA formulates accreditation standards, right? We can all agree that that's a national accrediting body, that we don't dictate those accreditation standards. So the AVMA tomorrow could say, you know what, we don't need 4, 5, and 6 anymore. We're comfortable that universities are doing this. We're an outcome-based, educational assessment program or accrediting body. We don't need that level of specificity. You leave the states then in a conundrum with what does that really mean? Do we have any criteria applied to these extern sites to ensure that the supervisor knows what they're expected to do with that student when they come to California to perform those duties? And is there a formal agreement that the board could, in fact, in an enforcement situation, go back and say, hey, supervisor, not student, supervisor, you fell down on the job, you didn't sign this formal agreement, you have a student who's been doing nothing but cleaning bird cages since they've been here. We have an enforcement role with the supervisor. That's a licensee of the state. So you can have Dean Nelson call me and he and I can have a discussion on consumer protection. I'm happy to do that. But I really do think what it does is it adds some level of protection for the state of California that regardless of what the COE does in the future, we know the expectation if you're going to have students here practicing in California under these sites, that there is a learning objective and an expectation within an MOU that that supervisor has agreed to with that university.
Okay.
Okay.
Obviously, I can't sway your opinion.
You might be able to.
Dr. Segni.
Yes, I tried to control myself, but I was unable to. When I read these two versions, the first one seems to me that it's all about looking at enforcing the quality of the learning experience. And the second one is more about ensuring consumer protection. There's a phrase under number 3 in the second version that says ensuring that the consumer is protected as the student is at the training site. I think it's an odd phrase, but nevertheless, I think the intent here, the board's responsibility, I would think, is to protect the public and to make sure, in this case, that all parties that are entering into this agreement are qualified for the exemption, primarily meaning that the student has met the criteria to work underneath this exemption. In other words, operate as a veterinarian without a license in California because they've met the requirements. The board, by accepting AVMA accreditation as an approved program in California, has accepted also, I think, that the university is responsible for providing the quality of the education and the learning experience, as they have to with COE, et cetera. They jump through a lot of hoops to meet that criteria. So, in my opinion, I think you would be better off with version 2 because I think it's more direct in protecting the public from anything that goes wrong during this process and that the student, in fact, qualifies to be this. So, my 2 cents.
I disagree, Dan. If A5B existed by itself, then that would be one thing, but it is a subset. It's the second part of A5A, where we've got stipulations about the licensee, we've got stipulations in terms of supervision. And so I think that there's some implicit oversight and consumer protection there. And I think that simply having a sentence at the end of all of this that says, and the consumer's going to be protected, which is what the second version offers. A mechanism for consumer protection is incredibly vague. I don't even understand what that means.
I agree. I don't think it's well written.
Yeah. And so I felt that it actually muddied the waters, not helped clear. And if you're going to say that, then why aren't you saying that for A, too, as part of the formal curriculum?
Well, it's all part of the same thing. Again, I would say that the version you're considering is more concerned about the quality of the learning experience, which I think the board has already approved by accepting AVMA accreditation. So that's my 2 cents.
We can strike number 3 in the second version.
I'm coming in on the side of your argument, and you just beat me to it. I really think that third sentence of ensuring consumer protection is a very important statement. Yes, it's a vague statement. How are you going to do it? It could be as simple as a large sign in the lobby that says, students are doing surgery on your animals, beware. Or the board could come up with some formal guidelines of how the consumer has to be notified that people are there training. And you don't have to accept the entire second version as his language, but that third statement could just be tagged on to the very first one. It is a powerful statement, and you are correct. We are here for consumer protection. That is more important than curriculum content. The schools do a very good job. I've received these students. I've looked at their curriculum. They come in with packaged curriculums of exactly what they have to do. Nothing is left to the imagination. They do a very good job of doing that. But how do I, as a consumer, taking my pet to your veterinary hospital, know that a student is there doing something, and how am I protected?
Can I say that? No.
Yes, Ron.
Thank you for saying that, because I made a mental note to myself. But under tab 2, the animal health care tasks veterinary students may perform at off-campus locations. On the last page, point 5A3. If the site is other than a veterinary facility, the supervising veterinarian shall have practical, and I'm assuming that means veterinary school, the supervising veterinarian shall have practicable orally inform the owner or custodian of the animal that graduate veterinary students may participate in the diagnosis and the treatment of their animals. That would replace my weak attempt at ensuring that the public is safe during this educational experience.
We're going to vote now on the language that's in front of us, and then we're going to take a 15-minute break. And then we'll come back and figure out if we're moving on with the agenda or we're continuing with this particular item.
Mr. Chairman, before,
Yes.
can I just restate the motion?
Sure.
So it would be that that the MDAC recommend to the board a statutory revision to the current existing section 4830, with it being the bottom of, these are unnumbered, but the first page of this student exemption issue memo, 48A5A unamended, and 48A5B as presented, except with the amendment that the words in place of an on-campus education be struck. So I'm just making sure that we all understand that I won't be voting for, but you will, because I'm not a member.
Dr. Klingborg.
Aye.
Dr. Druces.
Aye.
Dr. Grant.
Nay.
Dr. Pollard.
Aye.
Dave Johnson.
Thank you for the promotion again. No.
Christy Pulowski.
No.
Diana Woodward-Hagel.
No.
Jennifer Laredo.
Yes.
Dr. Sullivan.
Yes.
Drum roll, please.
We're split 5-5. We only have 9 members.
I know. Wait, we can't.
2, 3, 4,
think it's
5.
5-4.
5-4, so it passes.
You know, I
Motion
want to
carries.
make a point. though.
Wait a second. Did the motion pass or not?
Yes, motion
Okay, the
carries.
motion has carried.
Last comment, 4854.5 does require a sign. Does require a sign. That's already in the law.
We're just using that as an
But
example, but
that
there could be
points
other,
up
there could
my
be other sign
comment that the
designs.
law, is difficult to know.
We still have a fun agenda ahead of us, folks, and we'll be back at 3:40. 3:40.
Let's reconvene at the bar.
Oh, we still have to do.
Continuing with this agenda item, we're discussing proposed language on CCR 2027. And the current language on 2027 dealt with the junior or senior veterinary student or a graduate of a recognized veterinary college. And essentially, it was geared towards educational, or it was geared towards experience that was not part of the formal curriculum. So this would be the weekend trip to the local vet clinic where you were mentored and getting some hands-on working with animals, but it is not part of the off-site or distributive formal curriculum. And what we realized was there's actually two populations of individuals that were in the existing language. We've got students, and then we have this graduate. And the way that the 2027 was written allowed the graduate of a veterinary curriculum to function essentially as an RVT forever without having passed any kind of licensing exam. And so there are two pieces to the proposal of CCR 2027. You've got 2027 and you've got 2027.5. So 2027 is dealing with the veterinary student. And what has been omitted in this language, a couple things. One is the reference to the year in which the student is in their curriculum. Junior or senior is no longer there. And what's inserted is that they must have had training in the activity that they're going to be engaging in as part of their formal curriculum. But still, they may only function up to the level of RVT, and the supervision is identical to what would be allowed for an RVT for that specific job task. So that is, we're going to take these independently now because we have separated them out. So that is proposal for 2027, discussion from the committee.
Only a typographical one. A veterinary student of a recognized veterinary college.
Okay, so adding that language of a recognized veterinary college as was in the original language.
Right.
Okay. Other discussion?
What we're saying by referencing section 2022A?
It is. 22A, 2022A is recognized veterinary colleges.
Listed in section 2022. You just have to add the clause.
So a veterinary student listed in section
No.
20.
A veterinary student of a recognized veterinary college listed in section 2022, et cetera.
Okay,
The student isn't listed in other
Right.
words. Yeah.
yep, okay. So there's an addendum there, a veterinary student of a recognized veterinary college that is listed in section 2022A.
Correct.
Discussion from the committee?
Question.
Yes, Chuck.
You said you want to take these in two parts. Is that the proposed 2027 Part 1 and then the proposed 2027 5 Part 2?
Yes.
Okay.
If you feel that discussing 2027.5 helps inform our discussion of 2027, that certainly is fine, but they're separate vehicles.
So in the second part, I just have a question. I understand the motivation for putting a timeline on it, in this case 1 year. The current status is that person doesn't have a license. And in this case, they don't have a license, but they get the exemption, they get covered for a year. And then they have to get a license, correct?
That is correct.
Okay.
And one of the things that has been discussed, that keeps coming up in this discussion, and I'll be bringing it up tomorrow as I report to the board, is this is an individual that perhaps we should create an avenue for them to sit for the RVT exam. But this individual here is not passing their veterinary state boards. I mean, that's why they're not licensed at this point. Either national or state boards have not been passed. And it's allowing to keep them engaged in the profession, but because they do have that level of schooling, they've graduated from a 4-year program, they just haven't passed the tests. The question ends up being, what's an appropriate timeline for that? Dick?
Yeah, and that's where I think 1 year is way too long. I think if they graduate and are not licensed, we have no avenue to pursue their activity. They're not background checked, they're not fingerprinted, they don't have a license. So if there's a problem, we have to pursue it through unlicensed activity, which is very difficult. And, I would be in favor of giving them an avenue to take the RVT test. And now we've got, again, a paper trail, and we've got consumer protection. After they graduate from veterinary school, I think that's when they need to take that test if they're not licensed.
Yes.
When does the clock start ticking? I know it says here from the date of graduation. How would the board or anybody know when their graduation date was? And who is going, do they have to announce themselves to the board to qualify for this? Or is it just a matter of being caught up in a regulatory environment? How is this going to be enforced?
So, as we work through this, let me be clear, because we were talking about 2027, and now we're talking about 2027.5.
Correct.
Are there any questions or concerns about 2027? Okay. As amended. Okay. Any comments from the public on 2027? If there's a comfort level here, then perhaps we can vote and move 2027, and then we can delve into 2027.5. Yes, Nancy.
I have in my notes that you discussed at the last meeting about whether these people should have to have a VA CSP if they're going to be administering or obtaining or administering controlled substances.
And by these people, are we speaking of?
The students who are working in a veterinary hospital who are not RVTs.
Okay. Dr. Sullivan?
I would suggest that if they're not handling controlled drugs, they don't need it. If they are handling it, they definitely need it. Two separate issues, and they have to, if they're handling it and they're in a veterinary clinic, they have to have that.
Well, then does that need to be put into 2027? Because otherwise, are they exempted from all the other regulations?
Good point. Thank you. What do you think, folks? Dr. Pasco.
I just have a question. So is this language then in conflict with 4838.5 relative to surgery? Or not? I'm trying to decide which one trumps which one.
This is outside of a program. Am I missing something?
No. This is not part of the formal curriculum. And again, keep in mind that these folks can only function at the level of an RVT if they've had schooling in that. So they're not going to be doing surgery under 2027.
there's no memorandum of understanding here. There's no contract with the school. This is a student coming back to work and practice in the summertime.
Right, that's not part of, except that it does say part of a formal, so that provided they receive prior training in these activities as part of the formal curriculum. I'm just wondering whether they're at odds with each other.
Or the way I interpret this is that if 2027 is adopted, then even within the formal curriculum, our third and fourth year students could perform the identical job task of an RVT. That's the way I interpret it, whether it's in or outside the formal curriculum.
Respectfully, I don't necessarily, my understanding is that any line of demarcation about what their class standing in has been struck, and you're basically relying then on the dependent clause that provided that they have received prior training. So if they have the prior training in day 1, day 365, day 720, they can do that job because you don't have to have accumulated time and grade. The only thing you have to do is have accumulated prior training. That's the way I see that.
And who would define the prior training?
I believe that's going to be determined by the circumstances that you're at. So if you're at some site and they say, have you received prior training on this thing, and you answer in the affirmative, that would be good. It seems to be would be incumbent upon the site and the captain of the ship, like we used to say in the medical board, to ascertain that this individual has in fact obtained the necessary training.
It's up to the supervising veterinarian. So have you extracted teeth? Tell me what your curriculum has been. No, I haven't taken those courses yet. Okay, well, you won't be extracting teeth here then. So that's up to the license, the supervising licensee. Would it help if there was a clause in here that said that this individual was functioning outside of their formal curriculum? Because would that improve clarity of what we're talking about here?
If it's not under formal training, then this catches everything else.
Right.
I think it's clear to me, but
I agree.
You could also say, just because I do understand where the confusion came from, that we thought we were talking about students, and whenever you think you're talking about students, and and the word formal curriculum is in here, to the unknowing public, does this mean that this is somehow within the formal education setting? You could also say a veterinary student of a recognized veterinary college that is listed who is performing any animal health care task, you could say, and is employed at a veterinary premises registered by the board. I mean, you can change it to an employment setting so that, if that helps.
Well, the problem is a lot of those are volunteer experiences.
Okay, well then that wouldn't work.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Dr. Nunez, please approach the microphone. Cardinal Nunez, please approach the microphone.
We got five. Is Lee Heller still in the room? Yeah. 1, 2, 3. We got 5. One of them has to leave.
It's a quirk of the law, everybody.
we have a few of them.
I think the point is a good one, because when we were talking about veterinary students and liability, the liability was with the universities. But the way this is written, if I'm a veterinarian and I hire a third or fourth year student and I read the Practice Act and it says, I can allow you to do tasks that an RVT can do, provided that you've received the education and the training. And I ask that person, have you received the education and the training? And they say yes. I assume that they have, not really going to the school's website and checking the curriculum and making sure that they have received that training. And what if a mistake's made? Where is the liability then? Is it with? It's no longer with the university. It's with the veterinarians. So the way this is, not only do you have to, as a veterinarian, you have to know what.
Yeah, but Mark, how is this different than anybody else you hire?
Right.
I mean, you bring in somebody and...
Because I'm not going to allow anyone to do RVT tasks.
No.
I'm only going to allow registered RVTs and quote-unquote third and fourth year veterinary students.
But it's no different than your RVT.
I know, but I don't know, I'm not familiar with all the curriculums of all the veterinary schools to know that, yes, in their third year, they've learned dentistry, or maybe it's not until their fourth year. So there could be some confusion as far as they've received that clinical training. There's no way that I would know unless I really did due diligence, and I need someone to extract that tooth.
Yes, but the odds are you're not walking away and hoping it all works out well.
Well, I mean, that goes under my supervisory role, but the question on liability, I think, is a good point. I hope I made that clear.
I don't think there's any ambiguity. The liability in 2027 is with the supervising veterinarian.
But then I can go back and say, I was given assurance that the universities gave them clinical experience, and apparently they hadn't.
Yeah, Christy
But
and Dick.
how is that any different than I was given assurance that the RVT was taught how to do something when they went to school? I mean, I don't, at some point you need to be accountable and responsible. So you can, I think that it is the veteran, the law stated, the veterinarian.
And I think I answered the university's concern. You're off the hook. There wouldn't be any liability for the universities for RVTs performing, or students performing RVT tests.
Dr. Sullivan.
It's no different, as Christy said, it's no difference if I have an RVT that comes into my practice, or if I have a veterinarian that is licensed and comes in my practice. I've got to make sure they can do that task I'm asking them to do. Because if something goes wrong, as the licensing manager, I'm still have a responsibility that that person is competent. So I'm on the hook.
Yes.
2035 already covers that. So the supervising veterinarian shall be responsible for determining the competency of an RVT, right there. I mean, granted, they're not an RVT, but then it goes on to say, or unregistered assistant. So 2035 already covers their requirement of determining competency.
Yes.
Okay, so once again, this is me, I'm not speaking for Western University. I am, as a faculty member there, if that simple little sentence, provided they have received prior training, that's the difference in 2027 proposed versus the one up above. And then the third and fourth year versus all veterinary students. So that's the thing, is would the university, would our college be liable if somebody assumed, or maybe even asked another faculty member, did that student, because what are they going to do? They're going to ask the student, have you received training in putting in an IV catheter? That's probably, oh yeah, I did that. Does that make them, does that put them at the same level as a registered RVT? I think this whole 2027 was addressed because of those who graduated, never got licensed and practiced as an RVT without being fingerprinted and background check and everything else like that for X number of years. And I think we're just making too many changes.
Dick.
I really don't have a problem going back to the third and fourth year.
Yeah, exactly. That would make me feel a little bit more confident.
I think the other thing that will help with clarity is giving this section a title such as Student Job Tasks Outside of the Formal Curriculum. And if we have that title and then some language below this, then at least that does help us understand the population we're dealing with a little bit better. So one of the reasons why we moved away from third and fourth year was, of course, because the third year actually starts when you've concluded your second year. And so there was some ambiguity there. And then the other part was that every school teaches things in a little bit of a different order. And maybe somebody is highly capable of performing a specific job task at the conclusion of their first year, and somebody else doesn't actually encounter that until their third year. That was to allow for that flexibility.
I agree with that, but I also say, however we word it, it's incumbent upon the licensing manager to assign tasks that that person is capable of doing. And that means supervising that they have those skills. It has nothing to do necessarily with their training as much as it does that I can see that person successfully doing that task because I'm overseeing them and they've satisfied my concerns. I think if, most students, if they've completed their second year, they've had 4 years of undergraduate, 2 years of professional school, I think we need to give them some credit and leeway. And as a board, we have a responsible person in that practice that we've got a paper trail to, and that's the licensing manager. And so I think it's somewhat academic. I like the third and fourth year.
Would you like to propose language?
I'm not good at that.
So would you rather that
I would just, where it says they have received prior training in these activities, say, as the old language, what I believe it says, as a junior or senior student of a program. Yeah.
So you would like to go back to something that says a junior or senior student of a recognized veterinary college as listed in section 2022A may perform only the identical job tasks with the identical degree of supervision by the supervisor as specified for RVT pursuant to section 2036.
That's fine, and then add on.
Add on what?
Then address what I'm concerned about in 2075.5. So no change to the first one.
Yeah. So the other option there is to take 2027 and just line out or a graduate.
Oh, gotcha.
Okay, so that
Yes.
language then, we simply eliminate or a graduate
Yes.
in the current language, and no, I don't, there is no motion. But
Can you redo what you did? Yeah.
Can I what? So if you look at current 2027,
Right.
and you line out or a graduate, and strike that.
And that's it.
Okay. That's all we're doing. Yeah.
Well, it will be if there's a motion.
So moved.
Thank you.
Second.
Thank you. Okay, nice. Okay.
Maybe if we actually understood what we were doing.
Yeah.
Ironically, what I argued 3 months ago. on this meeting. Exactly what I argued 3 months ago.
That is ironic.
Let's go watch the tape.
Well, it took a while, but the guy who argued it 3 months ago finally seconded it. That would be Dr. Grant.
He was pouting.
Yes, and so we do have public comment.
Valerie Fenstermaker, CVMA. I just want to go back to you including a title with that. Is that part of your motion? Because I still don't think it's clear that it's outside of the formal curriculum.
So I had proposed student job tasks outside of the formal curriculum as the title of this section. This section currently is graduates and students of veterinary colleges - job tasks. And I proposed student job tasks outside of the formal curriculum.
The problem is we don't enforce the titles, that they're not our titles, so when these things go to print, the LexNexis gets to make up whatever titles they want for these sections. Very
Okay,
bizarre.
Okay.
So can you add that somehow to the text?
Yeah, I think that was kind of where the universities were on this, is it looked like it might have been something related to the externship.
I just want to make sure we don't lose that part of it.
Right,
If we
right.
can't add a title, then maybe it needs to be amended.
We could place that in a junior or senior student who is outside a curricular program, or however that wording you
Outside
want.
the formal curriculum.
Well, where it says that who is performing any animal health care task in a veterinary premises, I think you could say outside the university and clarify it that way, if that works.
Outside of formal curriculum.
I'm sorry?
outside. I would suggest that we start this with when functioning outside the formal curriculum, comma, a junior or senior student. Okay.
I'm not quite sure, so let's make sure where we're standing. So we had proposed 2027, which was the second paragraph from on the bottom page. Now we've decided not to tackle that, and so now we're on to 2027 with the current version being, we're going to strike out or a graduate. So my question as your attorney is there, the question, are we trying to avoid civil liability as far in front of the university? Because I'm going to throw a flag on the play and suggest that civil liability is not quite the role of this body. So I'm not quite sure if you just delete that phrase from 2027, I'm not sure that we have a clarity issue. I'm just not persuaded that we are, because this has been going on for some time, and I know what we just did to 48A30, but I'm just curious, is there real confusion over how this is going to be interpreted? Because I'm not really seeing it, to be candid with you, but again, I don't work in the veterinary practice, so with that, I'll be quiet.
Well, I think the confusion is you have student and you have recognized veterinary college listed.
Right.
So I think that's implying a curriculum, part of the curriculum.
Right.
Go ahead, I'm sorry.
I'm sorry, I defer.
It seems to me that the confusion, and I thought I heard it from the university a little bit too, is who is the student and what can they do? And so does this allow the student to go in on the weekend to, again, their mentor's clinic, not part of the formal curriculum, and do a spay, whether they've been trained in it or not? And there's a misunderstanding, I think, by the profession in terms of what students can come in and do. So there does need to be some clarity there that when they come in, if it's not part of the formal curriculum with the MOU and all that now, that they function as RVTs.
And as Dr. Nunez brought up, who the liability falls on.
Well, again, I honestly don't think that's that confusing.
I know,
Yeah.
but clarifying it, if they are a junior or senior student, it does make it very clear that they have knowledge. So I think it's clarifying where they are in their training.
Yes.
Okay. Not being a wordsmither or a attorney, it seems to me that if the structure by the board may perform only the identical job tasks, blah, 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 to specify for RVT, excludes those job tasks that are inherent to a veterinary assistant.
So they cannot do a veterinary assistant job task, they can only do the itemized job task for an RVT.
That's the way I could read it.
No, because RVTs can do anything veterinary assistants can do.
But that's not what this says.
But the law says that. I don't think that's the confusion.
May perform only the identical job tasks
But the
as
identical,
specified for an RVT.
but the identical job tasks are those that are
Right.
enumerated
And
plus everything that a veterinary assistant can do.
Right.
Okay.
Yes, Nancy?
I would suggest that you add a sentence at the end which says a student may not obtain or administer controlled substances unless they hold a VACSP.
That's law.
You need to do that when that law is already someplace else.
I think the law says you have to have it if you administer it.
Right, so it's already covered.
It's already in there.
It's covered someplace else.
Okay,
This is not an exemption to that.
Right.
so 2027.
Could we have maybe a final reading of it?
Sure. My notes indicate that 2027 would read as motion and second, a junior or senior student of a recognized veterinary college listed in section 2022A who is performing any animal health care task in a veterinary premises registered by the board may perform only the identical job tasks with the identical degree of supervision by the supervisor as specified for a registered veterinary technician pursuant to section 2036. So what we've done is we have struck or to graduate.
And we added, didn't we add?
I have no additions, Doctor. I just have, not being very good at math, I have one subtraction and no addition.
But to Diane's point, Diana pointed out that it's the colleges that are listed in section 2022.
Oh, that was.
Sorry, she already caught it there.
Oh, okay, got it.
So we have a motion and a second on the table with the language that has just been read. We're going to call for the vote now. Any other input from the public?
Oh, my God.
Why- Did I read? You did not read?
I've been waiting for somebody to bring that up.
Well, we argued earlier that to allow flexibility for changing curricula, that if we just use the word veterinary student, that saves us changing into the future. So that was my, because I think a lot of most curricula now, I'm just speaking with another hat on from a COE perspective, and most curricula have a lot of clinical training starting from the very first year, and so most of those RVT type tasks are already being taught much earlier in the curriculum than historically was done.
To be honest, I think that was put back in there as a form of consumer protection to know that you're dealing with the population that has a couple years of schooling. Yes.
I'm not certain that everyone is aware of what the RVT job tasks are. Veterinary assistants can do most things in a veterinary hospital that a veterinarian can't do, including putting in IV catheters. So I don't see that it's appropriate for veterinary assistants to be doing the restricted RVT job tasks unless they are properly trained. And there has to be some way of knowing that they have the training, the education and the training. I mean, this is why we require you have to be an RVT in order to do these things. So, just having some education doesn't mean that you know how to induce anesthesia. Doesn't mean you know how to suture. It doesn't mean you know how to extract teeth. So these are the kind of things that we have to be assured that these students have had some training in before we allow them to do it.
Dr. Sullivan and then Dave.
And I'll go back to my original statement that even if I hire an RVT, it's still incumbent upon me that RVT can successfully extract a tooth, safely extract a tooth, and do the other functions. Just because you've completed a test or time frame, the responsibility that person can, or even a veterinarian that's just graduated, responsibility that person can do that task is up to the licensing manager of that clinic.
I'm sorry, let me just, for those not to muddy the issue. So there is an analog in human medicine. So the physician assistant licensee works under a supervising physician. And the PA has graduated and has all his credentials. But along with Dr. Sullivan is saying, under the delegation of services agreement, the supervising physician gets to say, I'm really happy that you graduated from X and that you board certified or whatever, and this and that. Under my practice, you're going to do X, Y, and Z. And if you don't want to do X, Y, and Z, hit the brakes. So under this area, as again, not coming new to veterinary medicine, it seems like logical that the veterinarian here can say, look, here's the degree of supervision you're going to get, none. Therefore, you can't do this, not under my watch. So am I missing something? Is that element missing here? Because it seems logical to me that under the captain of the ship doctrine, again, that's borrowed from the medical practice of humans, if the supervising veterinarian says, I'm offering you no supervision, indirect, direct, I don't know what other words there are, but immediate, non-immediate from the next county or the next state, you're not getting supervised in this. That to me is a block that this person named enumerated here can't do that. That's kind of what and again, I'm throwing this out there for public consumption because maybe I'm missing the point. So maybe it's entirely possible.
Dave?
I just wanted to add a point of clarity. When we originally adopted this in '77, the theory was that 2 years of veterinary school was the equivalent of an associate's degree at a veterinary college, and that's why the junior-senior designation was there. And it's worked pretty good all these decades. I'm pretty comfortable with the junior-senior designation. I know curriculums are changing, but at least does assure that they've got 2 years' worth of education, which is the equivalent, supposedly, of an associate's degree.
Dr. Grant?
The example of extracting a tooth, in fact, that's probably one of the few things that I'm not happy that even RVTs can do it, because I've seen a lot of veterinarians out there that can't do it. It's gone on for a long time, and we've rotated a lot of excellent students from Davis, from Western, from other schools. I've yet to have a single one of them extract a tooth. I will be in surgery with them before I'm going to do that. And so your point about supervision is critical. It's all about the supervision, period. And to think that they have, there's really no way, at least in my opinion, of teaching it without doing it, because it's a very difficult task. So the point I'm just trying to emphasize is the supervision, and that's the key to that motion.
Will you read the motion one more time, please?
Certainly. Again, I'll paraphrase and I'll read it. So the motion is on the current 2027, which is delineated on page 2 of the memo. And the words "or a graduate" are struck, but I'll read it in its entirety. A junior or senior student of a recognized veterinary college listed in section 2022A who is performing any animal health care task in a veterinary premises registered by the board may perform only the identical job tasks with the identical degree of supervision by the supervisor as specified for a registered veterinary technician pursuant to section 2036.
Time to vote.
Dr. Klingborg.
Aye.
Dr. Druses.
No.
Dr. Grant.
Yes.
Dr. Pollard.
Yes.
Dave Johnson.
Yes.
Christy Pulowski.
Yes.
Diana Woodward-Hagel.
Yes.
Jennifer Laredo.
Yes.
Dr. Sullivan.
Yes.
Motion carries.
Excellent. We've got job security, because next year we can figure out how to strike junior or senior and go back to the more flexible curriculum. So we'll see it again. 2027.5, you have language in front of you. A graduate of a recognized veterinary college listed in section 2022A for the period of 1 year from the date of graduation may perform the identical job task with the identical degree of supervision as specified for an RVT pursuant to section 2036. So we did start our discussion on this, and now we will continue. Yes, Dr. Sullivan.
I hate to sink your ship, but I would like to go back to Nancy's comment on 2027, adding the condition of requiring, if they're to handle controlled drugs, that they're required to have a veterinary assistant animal control permit. That's not what it is. Veterinary assistant control substance permit.
Animal control officer /
It's getting late. Anybody who does that.
Kurt's correct. It's already in reg. Anybody who has access to, administers, and administers, obtains and administers a controlled substance has to have a permit. Easy for me to say. It would be redundant to add it to this, because then you would, if there's any other sections of the regulations where that phrase isn't added, does that exempt those individuals? So
I knew that. I just wanted to make it clear.
okay, thank you.
You were so clear, too. Sorry.
So 2027.5. There was some discussion about the 1 year, giving this individual who's graduated but not passed their national or state boards 1 year in order to function as an RVT, that may be too long. Yes.
I just have a question, because I don't honestly know. So if they graduate and take their nationals and fail, when can they take it again? What's the time period?
I think it's only offered a couple times a year. How often are the
If they fail
nationals?
their first time, because that's what we're talking about.
It's offered the Nationals is offered in November and April of each year.
Okay. So in a one-year period, they could,
For 5 years after they graduate.
so they could take it twice in 1 year.
Oh, 5 total times, that's right, 5 total times.
But they could take it twice in a one-year period.
Yes.
Yes.
Thank you.
Dr. Sullivan?
My concern comes with consumer protection in that if we have a person that is working as an RVT in a practice, they're no longer a student, they're in the practice working, and there's an issue, the only way the board can pursue that is unlicensed activity. So I want them to have a license as soon as possible so we can, again, have a paper trail and pursue if there's a problem.
Can you imagine as many scenarios where the supervising veterinarian in that case also isn't going to be on the hook, though? I mean, there is a licensee involved. It's not maybe the bad doer, but there is somebody there.
Well, what about in a animal shelter situation?
Yeah, but certainly from what we heard today. Christy?
Well, I guess I have concerns too if they can. So you want them to they're trying to get their veterinary license, and then they can't pass that. They can't become an RVT. They can't get their RVT license. I mean, it's a year. So they're trying to cram everything in. I think it's a reasonable amount of time, I guess, is what I think a year is reasonable. And I get it, I want enforcement as well, because it's unlicensed activity, but I think a year is reasonable. That's only 2 tests. So, but I know that was jumbled, but 10 words or less.
Just as an alternative, since we're looking at creating a new regulation, wouldn't it be more efficient, since the board already has the authority to determine the equivalent of an RVT education, to just allow these people to have an avenue to take the RVT exam, as opposed to a regulation to give them an exemption for a year? You're still passing a regulation, but pass a regulation that allows them to take the exam versus a regulation that allows them to be an RVT without a license.
Jennifer?
I agree with Dave. I would be more comfortable with these students having some sort of a license that we could regulate.
So I'm going to rephrase that because you probably didn't hear. Jennifer would be more comfortable with these students having some form of license. Is that correct?
Yes.
Now, here's my question. How often is the RVT exam on?
Right. That was kind of what my point is.
Yeah.
We have to create both.
Yes, public.
I agree wholeheartedly that we should create a new eligibility category to sit for the RVT exam, that a person who is a graduate of an accredited veterinary school should be eligible to sit for the exams. And primarily, in order to take the California RVT exam, which is a 50-question exam on veterinary law, which is offered every day. So there's no problem with anybody taking that very soon as their application is approved. And you may even want to figure out a way to expedite it by, if they've completed the program but maybe not quite graduated or something, so that they can get the process started earlier. I'm not certain about how to do that. The VTNE, the national exam, is offered 3 times a year, one-month windows. So there are more opportunities to take the VTNE apparently than the veterinary licensing exam, but it's only 3 times a year.
Dave and then Alan.
And I just wanted to add real quick, they used to have that option under the Bachelor of Science provision of eligibility, and then I don't think anybody really looked at the consequences when that Bachelor of Science was taken out. It eliminated that avenue for this group of people.
The California jurisprudence exam may be offered every day, but isn't there some restriction on frequency of taking it?
How many times you can take it?
If they fail?
Yes, you can only take it twice a year because it's the same test is offered for 6 months. Well, I would say if this person can't pass this exam, which has somewhere between a 95 and 96% pass rate, then they shouldn't be able to function as an RVT.
And they can't pass the veterinary. We have issues.
And how often does this occur?
Right.
So again, we've got proposed language for 2027.5. It seems like the major point of contention here is regarding this for the period of 1 year from the date of graduation. Nancy, I am going to talk with the board tomorrow about this whole issue of the graduate and whether or not we can find a way to get them to sit for the exam. So that's not being lost. That will come up. Yes.
I would think that you talk to the board tomorrow and consider referring that to the RVT subcommittee to have them write proposed language for that to allow them. I agree. I think it's a much better way of going, and it sounds like the general consensus here is really not for moving this forward.
Well, I guess I'm still a little worried about the frequency of exams, quite frankly. I feel like this person's graduated from a 4-year program. So they didn't fail their 4-year program. They failed their licensing exams.
You've got a person that's inducing anesthesia. Something goes wrong. Yes, you've got a permit holder there that's going to have ultimate responsibility, but you've also, I'm not sure where the board would go, how the board would go after the permit holder if this was shown to be a problem with a graduate veterinarian who's not passed the test. I don't know, have there been cases where that's been the case? Instances where that's been the case?
I can't speak to it. I'm not personally aware of a graduate student who is practicing in a practice that we've got. I don't know if Candace, do you have any information on that? Yeah, I'm not aware of the situation.
So is this an exercise in futility?
It's much ado about nothing. Yes.
Hi, Aisha Buis, RVT. What about offering a provisional registration as an RVT upon graduation where they do get fingerprinted and documented until they pass the official exam of some sort, whether it be an RVT exam or a DVM exam?
Okay. Is there a consensus here, or do we want to talk about tabling this at this point? We don't actually have an RVT subcommittee that I'm aware of, for one thing. So,
You have
well, there's shelter.
Shelter
Yeah.
medicine, all right.
They've got a lot on their plate. So I'm not opposed to having an RVT subcommittee, but another option would be to table this for now. And I think we need a motion for that.
I would recommend one because I think it depends on, at some point in time, what do you want to tell the board, Dr. Klingborg? Do you want to tell them, hey, we try to tackle this and we think more studies in order, or, continued scrutiny is in order, or what? So I would suggest that you have a motion so that, because I think you need to get clarification what you're going to tell the board.
Great.
Is the only factor here the timeline?
An avenue to take the exam.
Alternative pathway, I think.
Yeah.
Well, I want them licensed, so
I do want to point out as your attorney that I'm a little bit uncomfortable with the mindset that the only reason that somebody may not have gotten to licensure is that they failed the exam. There's other life circumstances that can get in the way. Again, it's perhaps not on the merits of this, but the mindset that because this person doesn't have license because they failed may not be accurate. As my notes indicate that when the MDAC last tackled this issue, what they were concerned with essentially 3 things. Number 1, these people are not printed. You don't have to be printed. Number 2, there's no CE requirement, indicating you have a person that's functioning, without CE, without continuing education. The third thing that surfaced at the last MDAC is that this is sort of a terminus, is that one could go to school or whatever and then just stop, and there would be no progression to licensure. And I think those were the 3 things that were coming out, at least from my notes. So to the extent that the board or the MDAC wants to tackle this and give it more study, that's fine. As your attorney, I'm just a little bit uncomfortable with the presumption or the assumption that the only reason you're not progressing to licensure is that you haven't passed the test. There may be, as lawyers would say, intervening forces that this board may not be aware of.
Dave?
I'd like to move we table this issue, and at the meeting tomorrow, you ask the board for clarity?
Well, can I let them know we need more study?
Exactly.
Okay.
That was my point.
Okay. I don't remember rules on tabling. Do we need a second?
No, it's not so much the table, the motion. I think it's more inherent that you want to say that we table this and recommend to the board that continued study on this subject because we perhaps did not achieve consensus. So.
Okay. Are we comfortable with that?
So moved.
Okay. Right.
Yes.
Do we need a roll call vote on that?
Public comment and then roll
Public
call.
comment?
Roll call it.
Dr. Klingborg.
Aye.
Dr. Druses. Dr.
You
Druses.
seconded, okay,
Yeah,
Mr. Chair.
I seconded. Yeah.
Aye.
Dr. Grant. Dr. Pollard.
Yes.
Dave Johnson.
Aye.
Christy Pulaski.
Aye.
Jennifer Laredo.
Aye.
Dr. Sullivan.
Nay.
Okay, motion carries. We have 3 more things on the agenda. We are actually going to discuss rodeo now because the legislature has asked us to discuss that. And so that is going to be our agenda item. And I believe that we're going to be escorted out of the room at 5 o'clock.
I think so.
Yeah, so we've got a 30-minute window here to have this discussion. Anne Marie, I would like you to kind of frame the conversation.
Okay, so the issue of rodeo can obviously cover many topics that have been near and dear to the board's heart for some time, but what we need to remember is that we are limited in terms of our scope of authority over rodeos. So specifically in our Sunset Review report, the legislature asked us to tackle the issue of whether RVTs could perform or provide some level of veterinary medicine at a rodeo with an on-call veterinarian available to, I guess, guide the RVT in whatever duties were required. So the on-call, and specifically I think it's probably will help to read the actual recommendation. It should be required that the management of any professional sanctioned or amateur rodeo that intends to perform in any city or county shall ensure that there is a licensed veterinarian present at all times during the performance of the rodeo, or an RVT who is under the appropriate degree of supervision of the veterinarian for those animal health care tasks that may be performed by the RVT at a rodeo. The on-call requirement for a veterinarian should be considered as insufficient to provide for appropriate oversight and the immediate treatment of injured animals at rodeos. So the legislature asked the board, what is appropriate for an RVT to do at a rodeo event under their current scope of responsibility? We responded to the legislature and outlined those emergency protocols that are already in regulation that an RVT can do on-site with orders, direct orders of a veterinarian. So now what we're considering is perhaps should there be protocols for tasks that an RVT may perform outside the direct supervision of a veterinarian at a rodeo with a veterinarian on call to provide any degree of supervision or guidance as necessary.
Question to go first. Jeff.
So, as you just read it, Anne Marie, are there 2 questions? One, should there be authorization to have an RVT in lieu of an on-call veterinarian?
Can you get to the microphone?
Sorry. So I just want to clarify, there are 2 issues. One, that there should be an RVT on site in lieu of an on-call veterinarian. And then 2, the list of duties that you would propose they'd be authorized to do.
When the board responded to the legislature in the Sunset Review report, the board made it clear that it's not in lieu of, that the on-call veterinarian was a necessary component. So that was part of our Sunset response. What the MDC has before the committee is what either emergency care provisions would an RVT be able to provide without any degree of supervision or direct supervision by a veterinarian? Or are there protocols that should be established for an RVT to function independent of a veterinarian being on site?
Dick, and then Alan.
What part of our response did they not like? I mean, I think the list of emergency animal care list that we provided covers, I mean, I don't go to rodeos and I don't take care of those animals, but this is a pretty broad area of first aid and emergency care. And I am trying to rack my brain to see if there's other things that could be done, but I think that's the essential until the on-call veterinarian can get there.
And I don't know, I recall at the last meeting, we did discuss the emergency care list as a board. I believe the reason why it was assigned to the MDC was there was some feeling there were things outside this list that may need to be tended to on site at a rodeo for the injury of an animal that was not inclusive of this list. And maybe someone can speak to that.
Ellen, Jennifer, and then Dave.
Okay, I realize from a political perspective what's trying to be accomplished here. In spite of that, I have a tough time visualizing, considering what should be done. I don't see a need here for any of this stuff. Every single animal that's at a rodeo has an owner. They didn't just fall from the sky, whether they're the calves or cows in roping events or the horses that are in almost every event. The owners of animals have responsibilities associated with Penal Code 597, failure to provide. Why is it not the owner's burden to be subjected to 597? As an example, we don't hardly, in Riverside County, we don't hardly get very many rodeos anymore. We just had, within the last year, a relatively big one in the city of Europa Valley. We rolled out on that. We were assured by the management of the rodeo that they had a provision for a veterinarian. Failing that, is it not the responsibility of the owner?
Can I respond to that? The way 596.7 is written, it is the responsibility of the management of any professional sanctioned or amateur rodeo. And I'll skip the middle part, but it says, shall ensure that there is a veterinarian licensed to practice in this state present at all times. And then it goes on to say, and able to arrive, or that's on call, and able to arrive within 1 hour after a determination is made that there is an injury which requires treatment to be provided by the veterinarian. So the onus is really on the management of the professionally sanctioned rodeo to provide for some veterinary care. In doing the research, and it's covered in this memo, background memo before the board, we contacted the PRCA, and what we learned is that they don't enforce that. So owners of animals, as you just suggested, choose not to have their animals treated if in fact there might be an injury. They either want to take them to their own personal veterinarian or they want to deal with it themselves. So how does the board, having no oversight over the rodeo itself, enforce that these owners have to have their animals treated? So I had assumed that like horse races and some events for showmanship of dogs, that you sign a waiver of release which says that if I enter my animal into this sanctioned event, that I understand that if the animal is injured on this premises or on the property, the animal will be treated by the on-site veterinarian, because that does exist in the world of horse racing. But that's not true. There isn't a release that we were able to uncover, and the PRCA confirmed that that's not standard protocol to have a release that the owner signs that says if my animal is injured at this event, I understand that I waive my rights to refuse veterinary treatment. However, the way the penal code is written, it says that the rodeo is responsible for making sure there's an on-call vet to treat that animal. So I agree with you. I think that the burden has been shifted to the Veterinary Medical Board, which has very little oversight and enforcement of the rodeo itself. And maybe that's what we need to communicate back.
Correct.
The second layer to this is the reporting aspect, which is our obligation, or the veterinarian's obligation, to report. They're only going to report those injuries that they treated and that they're aware of. So just for the sake of discussion, in years past, our reporting was very low. In your packet, you will see that in fiscal year now we're down to 2016 to, let's go 2015 to 2016. In years past, we had some years, less than 5 reports. In 2015, 2016, we're up to 16 injury reports. And part of that has to do with the board's outreach and communication to the veterinary population that if you're going to be a rodeo veterinarian, you have an obligation to report these injuries, either if you treated them on site or within 7 days of the event. So we also included in the packet our license renewal information sheet, and this was going out in late 2014, early 2015, and forward, which we included the rodeo injury report requirement of 4830.8 to reinforce that this is an obligation. So we're seeing more reporting now, and there's more visibility, and it could be perhaps because there has been more legislative attention to this as well. I don't know why our answer wasn't good enough. I can't answer that question. I can tell you that my understanding from previous conversations was the list of emergency care duties that an RVT can perform without a veterinary supervision may not cover the breadth of what could happen at a rodeo where an animal may need care, and that's what we're here to discuss.
Got Jennifer, Dave, and Dick.
I'd very quickly like to state that unlike Dr. Sullivan, I do attend rodeos, and I have never attended one where a veterinarian was not present. That being said, it was brought up several times that sometimes in remote locations, they don't have access. So if I am the RVT who is attending the rodeo, and I'm falling under the emergency care, the things that I see missing are pain and sedation. When you have a large animal that's injured, they are going to thrash about and further injure themselves before the vet can get there. So pain and sedation are the main ones I see missing. Thank you.
And Jennifer just beat me to it. I have attended rodeos. I watch rodeos regularly. I've done large animal work in my career. And the component that's not there in the emergency regulations is not only the ability to calm that animal down to prevent further injury, because a lot of these are cattle and horses and large animals that are difficult to reason with when they're panicking, but also the ability, some of these animals are so seriously injured, they need to be euthanized immediately. And so we might look at that component of, with consultation, the doctor's always in the loop on this, we're not talking about independently, but with a conversation with the on-call veterinarian and the concurrence of the owner to euthanize that animal. The horse that falls down, breaks its leg at a rodeo, you can't say, oh, well, gee, the veterinarian's going to be here in an hour. There needs to be something more done to that animal.
Yeah, my comment was along the same line, but our problem is the vehicle. I don't see how, many of these drugs we're talking about are controlled drugs, and to be effective, and I think that's a problem. There's the Mobility Act, as I read it, the federal law does not allow veterinary technicians, RVTs, to carry controlled drugs.
Right, and that most certainly is an issue, but on the other side, there are non-controlled drugs that are very good for calming large animals that are not controlled substances.
Okay.
Much better than in small animal practice.
Ellen?
With all due respect, they don't, when you've got an animal, whether it's a horse or a cow, that's all cranked up, short of narcotics, you can't calm that thing down.
Public comment.
I believe that the reason this law even exists is because animal welfare advocates were concerned that animals were being injured at rodeos who were not getting veterinary attention at all, and that by requiring an RVT on site, every animal would be getting the proper veterinary care that it requires. I don't exactly see how the Veterinary Medical Board fits in here, except perhaps in adding 1 or 2 job tasks to the emergency regs. It would be up to the legislature to determine whether they're going to require an RVT on site as well as a veterinarian on call. But it seems like that, I mean, this is where it's coming from. It's coming from an animal welfare perspective, and, you know, whether the owner wants to do anything or not, that's not the concern here. The concern is for the animal's sake. And since this is a public event, hundreds of people are witnessing this event, the purpose was to make sure that the animals are taken care of.
Dave, and then Dave.
One more thing I wanted to add to that, along to tag on to what Nancy was saying, and Anne-Marie, get back to something you commented on, also Dr. Jersey. So the individual owner of that animal, the animal's injured, and they choose to use their own veterinarian. The advantage of having the RVT there is that they have the knowledge of the law. They can independently contact the animal control jurisdiction in that area and say, we would like a welfare check on that animal. And those animal control officers will go out and make sure that under 597, that animal has gotten veterinary care appropriately. And then there's the legal side of it, that if they haven't, they can be cited, and that animal could be seized if it was appropriate.
Good point. Dick?
Yeah, I want to go back to same issue that Anne-Marie was saying a little earlier. There's two issues here. One is the enforcement, which we're kind of being pulled into. I think we need to try to transition that over to animal control and get our name out of it. I have no problem with the reporting of the cases to the Veterinary Medical Board, but somehow we shouldn't. I think that's probably keeping some veterinarians from being at the rodeos. I don't think we should be the enforcers there.
And as a representative of an animal control jurisdiction, yes, that's what we do. We would enforce this. We do enforce it, and we would enforce it. For personal experience, when I was in equine practice, I was asked on a number of occasions to be the veterinarian of record. The problem with that is that the rodeos generally didn't want to pay me to sit around all day long. They wanted me to be on call, and I could not guarantee that I could be there within an hour when I was 50 miles away up in the mountains. And I don't know what they did, because I never performed that function because of those limitations.
Action item.
I think it may be feasible to, the MDC could consider recommending to the Veterinary Medical Board to report back to the legislature that, again, there are these emergency animal care provisions, but the issue as we understand it isn't so much the reporting aspect, but more the owner's refusal to have care administered on site. And that really is an enforcement issue that we need to involve animal control officers. And perhaps that's the more viable solution to this, as opposed to, I think in our response to the legislature, the board was agreeable with an RVT on site to perform these emergency animal care tasks was appropriate with on-call veterinarians. But that if there is a true enforcement issue of injured animals not being treated, that this needs to be reported to animal control. And animal control actually has the access to the controlled substances that may be necessary to sedate the animal or euthanize the animal, as the case may be.
Do we need a motion? So moved.
Second.
We have a motion and a second. Discussion from the committee. Public comment.
The motion would be to recommend to the Veterinary Medical Board a response to the legislature to reinforce that the RVT tasks under the emergency care provisions are appropriate on-site at a rodeo with an on-call veterinarian. However, in doing the research on the existing problems with reporting, we found that it's the owner's refusal to have their animals treated on-site at the rodeo or see the veterinarian assigned to the rodeo, and that truly is an enforcement issue that the board would encourage working with animal control officers to enforce the requirement under the penal code for treatment of injured animals at rodeos.
That would be Penal Code 597.1.
Any discussion? Okay. Let's vote.
Dr. Klingborg.
Aye.
Dr. Druces.
Aye.
Dr. Grant.
Aye.
Dr. Pollard.
Aye.
Dave Johnson.
Aye.
Christy Pulowski.
Aye.
Jennifer Laredo.
Aye.
And Dr. Sullivan.
Aye.
Motion carries. We have a little bit more work to do here, but we are not going to discuss the action items, the agenda items that we've not gotten to, that is compounding and the induction of anesthesia versus sedation. Those will roll over to our next meeting. It is time now for public comments not on the agenda. Okay. Hearing none, then I think we need to go over our upcoming schedule.
Okay. So the next meeting is scheduled for January 17th to be held in Sacramento, the day before the Veterinary Medical Board meeting. And then we have the rest of the 2017 meeting dates. I believe in April, we're looking at Oakland again at the waterfront where we were last year. And then Sacramento in July perhaps, and Southern California in October. July and October locations may be flip-flop depending on availability of hotels. But that's the plan thus far.
Any questions on that? Looking at our assigned priorities here. Well, you can see them for yourselves. We do have the evaluating structure and audit enforcement case outcomes. That's an existing priority. Probably we'll have a report on that at the next meeting. Ongoing development of standards for alternate premises. That's work that's being done in conjunction with, and the heavy lifting being done by the CVMA Premises Task Force. 4835, item 3, we have moved forward today, but as you recall, with 2027, we passed some language and have tabled other language. I will be discussing with the board tomorrow the extended duties conversation. Item 5 is compounding. We will get into that next meeting. I will be making item 6, the recommendation to the board tomorrow, if I can remember that giant thing we just said. And item 7, sedation versus anesthesia, big discussion. We'll be getting into that. And then for your leisure reading on the way home, I was bored one weekend and wrote up a draft of minimum standards for spay-neuter clinics, which is an upcoming agenda item. And so this is simply informational at this point, and that will roll up into existing priority at some point. So just wanted to introduce something, get it out there, have it as a topic of conversation, but not now and not at this meeting. And then we see some other future priorities that are there. And I don't know that they're specifically our priorities yet, but they're they're sort of in the parking lot right now. Yes?
Did you, matter of fact, we talked about it, was in the minutes of the last meeting, mentioned to the board about case management with mobile specialists, mobile?
Yep.
It's number 9.
Okay.
Yeah.
On that list?
Yep. Yeah. So it's there as a future priority. We're just trying to create room for it. Okay. And then we've also will have drug counseling, risks and side effects, and that will be on the agenda for the next meeting. Okay. That's all I got for you at this point. Anything else? Motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Okay.
Adjourn.
Great. Thank you, everybody.